a tutor. I've been a tutor and a student experience manager in the OU Law School, and I'm delighted to be hosting the event this evening with my dear colleague Neil Graffin, who is one of our OU legal academics. Just before we start, can I remind you, please, that to ask any questions that you have in the Q&A box, which is up at the top of the screen there. You can click on that and write your questions there, and we will deal with those at the end of the presentation. That was great. So, welcome to this Bringing Law to Life session. This is one of a series of 14. I think this is probably the third or fourth one, and there are many more to come. So please do sign up for some of the other sessions. You can do that through the Student Live Hub or through the Opportunity Hub, and there are links there. In fact, I'll stick a link in the Q&A if that's helpful. So why are we doing these sessions? Partly because we want people to be able to have an idea of all the various things that you can do with a law degree that's not necessarily being a solicitor or a barrister, but also to think around some of the more knotty issues around diversity and accessibility, because the legal profession does recognise and it does value diversity and inclusion, but it's not always been the quickest at taking steps to foster an inclusive environment. Equality and diversity is something that the law has recognised for many, many years, and the government wants a strong, independent and diverse legal profession. And a legal profession will only be strong if it's diverse and it represents all of the groups in society that the law is required to deal with. So we've looked at the figures that the Solicitors Regulation Authority has, and there's 53% of lawyers now are women, but sadly they do not get into the senior roles in firms, whether that's through family issues, whether that's through prejudice. The trickle-up effect is not working for many reasons. Only 19% of lawyers, though, come from different ethnic backgrounds, and only 6% have a declared disability. Only around 4% are would identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual or transsexual, and only 18% of lawyers come from what would be regarded as a lower socioeconomic background. And in fact, something that horrified me, I don't know if you're aware of this, Neil, was that the Solicitors Regulation Authority, so those of you that want to become a solicitor, you'll know about the SQE exam, I should think. The single biggest factor identified in being successful is having gone to independent school. That is the single biggest thing that determines success or not. And I suspect that's to do with family wealth and being able to buy into one of these crammer courses and so on. But it's very sad that the SQE that was meant to increase diversity seems still to be marginalising people from lower socioeconomic background. Doesn't mean to say you can't get in and you shouldn't be fighting to get in, but it is a fight. So in this series of talks, we're aiming to increase awareness and understanding, not only of the obstacles, but actually of the opportunities and support that are available for students from some of these underrepresented groups to enter the legal profession. And with that in mind, it's my very great pleasure to introduce my colleague Neil Graffin, who is one of our academic lawyers. We call them central academics at the Open University, worked in the law school since 2009. And I'm going to start off, Neil, by asking you, how did you get to being a legal academic at the OU?
Hi, yeah. Well, um, I I decided from quite an early stage, when studying for my law degree. I did a law degree, by the way, because I wanted to do English literature, and I think my mum at the time told me I'd be better off being a lawyer.
That resonates.
But um, but yeah, I from a very early stage, I decided that I didn't really want to become a solicitor. It probably wasn't looking like a pathway that I wanted to go down, or a barrister. Um, and that, like, I have lots of friends and colleagues, and my wife went on to become a solicitor as well, um, who really enjoy that, and who have made a really good life, working life out of their practice and everything else. It just wasn't something at that particular moment in time that I felt that I really wanted to go down. I was interested in human rights, and I was interested in different areas of law that I wanted to kind of look at really in more depth, and to do a bit of research into them. So I had decided that I wanted to do a master's, and I did a master's straight after my law degree. So I finished my law degree, um, and decided to go straight in, and I did a master's, and I did a master's in human rights and criminal justice, which was partly criminology as well. And I did a desert. I completed my dissertation on, an area which was quite relevant to the time, which is maybe not so relevant just within the current climate, which was on whether you should be able to, um, inflict inhuman and degrading treatment or torture on terrorist suspects. So this was during the war on terror. So Guantanamo Bay was, uh, you know, open at the time, and books, but it was very active at the time, I should probably say. It continued to be open, for many, many years. Um, so I was looking at sort of a lot of the abuses that come out of that, and I decided after that 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 wasn't enough for me, and I wanted to do a PhD. And I decided that I would do that part time and work at the same time, not really fully appreciating, as I was in my kind of early 20s, not really fully appreciating that it would take me 7 years to then finish that PhD. Um, and I did start working. In the meantime, I'd moved to Manchester, and I was working for the Open University. And I didn't actually start working in the law department initially. I worked in student support. So I would have worked with students, a lot of our disabled students, for example. I would have created profiles that then go on to the student profile that tutors can see, for example. Or I would have, done things like I would have organised additional examination arrangements for students where they might get additional time. I would have organised for students to have, edu- uh, educational assessments for specific learning difficulties, such as dyslexia or dyspraxia and all that sort of stuff. Um, as well as just being the point of contact for course change or withdrawal from modules or whatever it might be. Um, and after a period of time, I finished my PhD. I was working as an associate lecturer, and I was teaching basically part time, just like your tutors teach you. I continued to do that, um, and I was teaching human rights, and, well, initially actually I taught what was W21, the individual in the state, and that is now being replaced. It's kind of been split up. It was replaced then by W203, which is public law and criminal law. And some of you may have studied in that particular module. It's now been split up into criminal law, on W111, and the public law module in W211. Um, so, I've taught basically those subjects since, in contract law for a period of time as well. So yeah, um, it's been a long journey. As a central academic, my role is basically writing the materials, although I'm a manager at the moment, but it has been for the most part writing the materials that you will learn, the module materials that you learn, um, creating the content that goes online basically. And I, conduct research as well, which is a primary role of all our central academics. So we will research on different topics. At the minute, I'm doing research on barristers, clerks in England and Wales because I do some research on the legal profession. Um, and I am doing some work on search and rescue in the Mediterranean. So I'm looking at how search and rescue workers have been criminalized, for example, when they're trying to save migrants who are crossing the Mediterranean Sea. So that's largely at the minute. I've got a few other bits and pieces going, but that's largely my role.
Right. So it sounds from what you're saying as if it really helps to have a passion about or a real interest in a subject area and to pursue that into further study. Would that sound about right?
Yeah, yeah, and that's where it came from for me. I was really interested in human rights at the time. I was involved in different things with Amnesty International and continued to be for a short time afterwards. Um, and I just really kind of sort of see myself as potentially moving into academia, probably from an early stage, or if that didn't work out, maybe working for the voluntary sector, working for an NGO, working for example, at a time, um, I was looking at the likes of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission and places like that. So that at the time, that's what I was sort of aiming towards. It wasn't the legal profession for me. I was interested in the human rights based stuff.
Yeah, actually, that's a really valuable point. That if you are somebody who's really interested in a particular area, but you don't necessarily want to go into the academic life, you don't necessarily want to publish, there are good jobs available in various charities, public sector bodies in that specific area of interest. So
Yeah,
that's also worth looking for.
absolutely, and it's transferable as well. I've seen
Mm,
academics move out of academia and go into these organisations
yeah,
and work for various organisations um, that are human rights based NGOs or whatever it might be, or
yeah.
the Refugee Council or various things like that. And we also have academics in the law school, for example, who've previous experience working for human rights based organisations and then have moved into academia. So it's
Mm.
transferable in that regard. Yeah.
Yeah. So, what advice would you give to students about who might be interested in becoming an academic, about how they might go about it?
Yeah. First of all, just as you say, Bryony, having a real passion for what you're studying is really important. Um, for me, I had an idea for my master's dissertation that ultimately was then changed and modified, but the the area was roughly within the same area in which I completed my PhD, which is on police interviewing and ill treatment in detention. Um, and I was really interested in that particular area, and I was really interested in the case law of the European Court of Human Rights. And it was just kind of having that passion really, to take that forward. Um, what ultimately became 8 years if you count my master's PhD, or sorry, my master's dissertation and then my PhD. It's a long slog, you know, 8 years studying the same subject whilst working full time and working in the evening. You need to be really, really dedicated and you need to have a drive to kind of take that forward. And that was different. Not everybody does a PhD part time. That probably I'm an outlier in that regard. A lot of PhD students will do um, their PhDs, for example, over 3 years, which is the normal sort of
Hmm.
studentship length of term. That's I have a number of PhD students now. I'm a PhD supervisor of currently 3 PhD students who are all going through the process. One of them's just finishing up, hopefully very shortly. Um, but um, they have all done it over the space of 3 years. That's what the length of the studentship is there for. It's not quite that length of term for everybody else. But again, that's 3 years of really intensive study where you're trying to write up to 80,000 words, which is a lot of writing when it has to be really high quality to publishable standard work. So you really need to kind of grind it out for those 3 years. And really dedicate yourself to research and reading, really, and getting the words down
Yeah.
on the page. So
Is there any way into becoming a legal academic if you haven't first got your PhD?
um there is. It's increased. The market's increasingly difficult now, I guess, and a lot of places do ask for PhDs first of all, but there some people will be practitioners initially, and they might move into academia through that route. But it's it really depends. And there are people that have come at it through a strictly teaching route, and they've managed to kind of get into academic departments. Um, it is a market whereby having a PhD is very beneficial, particularly if you're wanting to go into what would be a teaching and research contract, which is what most academic sort of roles are. There are some roles which are teaching only, for example. Um,
Mhm.
but if you're going to go into a teaching and research role, then generally it's mostly expected that you would have a PhD.
Mm. Given that there is the time and the financial commitment for doing a PhD if you aren't lucky enough to obtain some funding, I'm just wondering how accessible or diverse you think the becoming an academic is.
Um, yeah, it's like if you came to the likes of the OU, and this will be true of other universities as well, um, if you had disabilities or additional requirements and you needed support, you can get support like through, say, if you needed an ergonomic chair or ergonomic sort of equipment, wherever it might be, mouse, keyboard, readout software, that sort of thing, that can be supported through the likes of the disability office. Um, it is the case that you will likely have to do a lot of reading, but if you have difficulties, for example, reading a lot of text from a page, you can get readout software, which will allow you to kind of, but should be able to help with that type of thing. Um, it can be sometimes, it can be sometimes, difficult to think about all of the things that you might get into place for yourself. So it's often a worthwhile thing to do is to speak to the disability offices of wherever you're applying and explain your individual circumstances and see what they suggest in terms of the things that might be there to support you. When I worked in student support, for example, a lot of what I was doing was trying to write profiles, as I said earlier on, but a lot of what I was doing was signposting individuals to the disability office, getting them to have conversations with them, work out exactly what it is they needed to support, to get the support that they needed. In some cases, that might have been one-to-one mentoring, for example, if it was the case that a student was neurodiverse, for example, and maybe had some difficulties with being involved in different aspects of what they were studying. They needed that one-to-one support in mentoring, for example. Or it might be that if a student had a specific learning difficulty like dyslexia, they might need to be shown certain kind of things that could help them, such as using coloured overlays, which sometimes help students with SPLDs read, for example, or kind of work through mechanisms of practice to help them with being able to concentrate whilst reading large kind of tracts of information.
Mhm.
So there is support there available, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I think by and large it is accessible. In terms of how we operate at the OU and many campus-based, well, we're not a campus-based university, but for PhD students, we did have a requirement that students needed to be within a certain radius of our main campus in Milton Keynes. That's somewhat changing now. We are hopefully offering distance learning PhDs, but for many campus-based universities, it may mean that you have to go in occasionally to the campus. Generally, campuses are accessible for those with physical disabilities. I was just at a conference, for example, last week, and I have colleagues in other universities, for example, with physical disabilities who were attending different sessions and were able to do so successfully because the universities were generally accessible for those staff members as they would be for students. And it is a legal requirement that these public spaces are accessible. Um, and hopefully, if you are thinking of going down that route, you you would get the support that you need. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, Neil. There's something I'd just like to add briefly, if I may, is if is sort of not to be put off if the accessibility issue for you isn't a disability, but is around, for instance, the fact that prior education has been disrupted, you've been care experienced, you've been first in the family to go to university, and you don't feel that you have the tradition or what we would call the social capital, is actually really to encourage people to give it a go, because if you have a passion about a subject, then you are likely to be able to get through those barriers and become the expert on that subject, which is what the PhD is in effect. And I was talking with colleagues today and who were saying that increasingly, for instance, care experience students are turning to law degrees, which hasn't been the case in the past, with a view to perhaps qualifying as a lawyer and then trying to make a difference, trying to act for children, make their lives better. And the comment was made that actually wouldn't it be brilliant to see care experienced people coming into the academic world, because what's desperately needed as well is the research, the people to actually look at what's happening, to get an overall view of what's happening in the country. And that in its turn can help inform policy and law, which in its turn helps to inform the legal practitioners. So if you're a student who doesn't really fancy becoming a solicitor or a barrister or an advocate, that actually the academic route may well be somewhere where you can make a difference and make your mark.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, lived experience is really, really important,
Mm,
in terms of, just informing what it is you're researching, and also it gives you that drive and that passion. Um, I've seen people with lived experience, like I had a, I've had students in the past with lived experience, and it really has given them a drive to push things forward. And I think when you're going to be studying something so intensely over a number of years, whatever that might be, 3 or in my case 7, then that you really need that level
mm.
of motivation. So definitely.
Yeah. Yeah, and having the experience helps. That's great. Thank you. We've got a couple more minutes. So really just two more things I want to ask you. Briefly, what's the work-life balance like?
As an academic,
Dare I say it?
no, I've, I mean, I worked 9 to 5, and like I do occasionally when it's marking, for example, you often find that you have to work at the weekends, and we obviously take um tutorials and different things in the evening, and so it is something which um you might find you're working some unsociable hours. I'm just back from a conference last week in Liverpool, for example, so you end up going, like for me, I was traveling to Liverpool. I've traveled
Mm,
abroad for different conferences in
yeah,
the
me too.
past. I managed to spend a week in Australia at one point, when in my earlier years as an academic, for example, when I was there for various things. Um, so you will be away at times. You don't necessarily have to be away all of the time. It's really, at least my experience is, it's really up to yourself.
Mm,
Um, but but you do get a lot from international kind of conferences and making those connections and disseminating research and understanding better mechanisms of teaching, for example, from other colleagues. So yeah, that's a, I say work with life balance is good. I do a lot of research in relation to other parts of the legal profession. I would say that it's better than other parts of the legal profession.
mm. Fantastic. And just finally, any role models or mentors that have been really helpful to you?
Yeah, I mean, I had a really good PhD supervisor who supported me, particularly through, um, particularly through probably a part of my life where I wasn't thinking to myself like I should be working constantly. You know, I was in my early 20s, for example. I was uh, wanting to enjoy myself at the same time. A really patient uh, supervisor who also was writing brilliant work at the same time and was able to help me make various different connections. And like I didn't come from my family background is that I didn't my neither of my parents went to university, so I wasn't able to rely on them and talk to them about my PhD. And often that is the case with your PhD anyway. It's quite a lonely experience because you're studying something quite in depth and it's hard to relate that to somebody you know outside of the kind of small world that you might be conducting research in. So I was able to kind of like talk to them about it a lot, and then when it came to my Viva, which is what you do at the end of your PhD, I was able to talk to my external examiners. I've had great colleagues as well, wonderful colleagues through the years that have been really supportive. I will say academia isn't a solitary exercise in the sense that it's not something which you can really be successful by yourself. You need to lend in the experience of others. You need to kind of send others your draft articles or your draft book chapters or whatever it might be, um, and get them to review those and different things and really borrow from each other's experiences. That's one of the reasons, you know, one of the reasons I was at a conference, for example, last week to kind of get feedback and to hear from other people about what could be improved upon. So that is important within the academic worlds. It has to be a community of practice. It has
Yeah.
to be a community of teaching and learning, really.
Yeah. And you do build up friendships outside your own university as well. I was at a conference sort of the week before, and it's just lovely meeting so many different people from all over the world with all sorts of eh, topics that they're passionate about, and including one very lovely therapy dog who was open to pats and strokes from everybody. But he was a very welcome part of the team. But as a result of that, and talking about our work, we may well be working in collaboration with some academics in Scotland because they're doing work that's similar to ours. So you never know who you're going to meet and make friends with. So if
Yep.
anybody is interested, sorry, thank you very much, Neil. I don't see any questions in the chat box, so I'm going to just move on to the final couple of things, which is final advice, really. If anybody does think that a career as a legal academic might be for them, um, if you are at level 1 or level 2, you might want to think about taking some of the modules next year that do have a research or component. So I'm thinking sort of W350, W360, as a little way of tasting and seeing whether that's for you. You don't have to, but those options are worth considering. And the best resource that we have are the Careers and Employability Service. So it's there on your law study home site. They love seeing people. You can search opportunities. There's a really useful session where you say, what can I do with a law degree? And it will take you through all the different things that you can do and how you will get qualified to do that, what the salaries are like, and so on. So please do use that. And other resources that they have are the Navigating Your Future pathway, building your futures with confidence. And as OU students, you are really well placed to join this work. You're all people who are passionate about what you do because you're giving up your spare time and your money to do it. You've got great organizational skills because you're coping with life as well as coping with study. So please, if you feel inspired by this, give it a go. As Neil says, there are different ways in, and there are ways to move around. So thank you very much for coming, everybody. We hope you found it useful, and it would be lovely to see some of you as our law school colleagues in the future. stop the recording there, Grace.